Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. Today we're going to be talking about the Neo SD loader for our friend the SNK Neo Geo CD. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. If you could follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, I really appreciate that one. As well as there's things like Spreadshirt, there's my new travel channel called Flying and Eating. I appreciate the support on those various platforms. I could really use it. Thank you very much, and let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about, again, is the Neo SD loader. So before we do anything, let's just go ahead and fire it up and actually show it to you in action. It is, of course, part of the Neo Geo CD. It is a recent device called an ODE, which stands for Optical Disc Emulator. You can see it there booting up. You saw a little SD card. One elevator pitch of what it is that you install a device into the system that allows you to put an SD card onto it. Once the SD card is in there, you can put games on the SD card and therefore play all your games off of it, thus reducing problems like load times and all sorts of, and then you also have the convenience of everything being on a simple little card, etc. That's the elevator pitch. So let's talk about all the details here. Now, I first have to give a huge shout out here to StoneAgeGamer.com. They were cool enough to send me the board for this thing months ago for the purposes of review, and until recently I just couldn't actually do it because I lacked the technical skills to actually install it myself. So full disclosure, this was sent to me for free for the purposes of review. And also because I did lack those skills, my buddy Chris, who is awesome, he does mods and repair work, I'll put a link to him in the description as well as email specifically, he was cool enough to install this for me. He specializes in things like PC Engine and TurboGrafx, but he can obviously do other work such as this, so if you want to hire a guy who's reliable and can fix stuff, there you go. And if you like this or any of the other devices that Stone Age Gamer has, there's a link there as well for them. So huge shout out to both of them. They made this possible, so now we can talk about it. Yes, so since I realize the Neo Geo CD is not history's most popular console, I do want to give a little bit of a history lesson here before we talk about the specifics of this device. So yeah. Basically, SNK is a company that made a ton of arcade hardware. They did great with things like King of Fighters and all that sort of stuff. They made the Neo Geo MVS line. They also made a home console called the Neo Geo AES, and it's somewhat of an attempt to get into that market. The problem was they made a system that was too good, the Rolls-Royce of consoles. It was a perfect home arcade experience. It was also prohibitively expensive as a result, so only like the super rich could really get one. It was just too expensive. And so in '94, SNK decided, let's maybe release the system again, try to make a little bit more money off of it. That was the Neo Geo CD. They basically took the disc drive, or the cartridge slot out and put the disc drive on, thus allowing them to sell it for cheaper. Now, if you ask me, they failed for a lot of reasons in that, mostly due to just strange decisions. As you can see, there's three models of the system here. This is the front loader. This one only came out in Japan and only made 10,000 units before they decided to completely change it into this. This is the top loader. This is by far the most common version of the system, as this was not only released in Japan in bigger numbers, it was also the only version released outside of Japan. This came out in the United States, it came out in Europe, this was available more widely. And then to address a very significant problem, they released the Neo Geo CD-Z, which was a revision that once again only came out in Japan. Now, that was a flaw, like the confusion therein was a big enough flaw on its own, but also the timing. Releasing it in '94, like there were already 5th gen systems that were out at that point. I believe the Saturn was already out, 32X was out. I think the PS1 in Japan was already out. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But yeah, it was kind of a strange choice to do it at that point. That was like the first big problem with it. The other big problem with it, and I talked about this more in my rare variants of the CD-Z, was just the fact that they like came out with this really anemic disk drive. The disk drive on the Neo Geo CD is famously bad, to the point where I'm going to show you some footage here. So what we have, you have comparison footage, right? On the one hand, you have King of Fighters 95 running off of the disk drive of the Neo Geo CD top loader. You also have footage of it, the exact same game, running off of the SD card. Hence the whole point of this device, and then some. There's a lot of additional benefits, but yeah, the CD-Z, if it wasn't clear, they released that as a later edition with a better disk drive that ran about 2 times faster than the stock one. Now, I'm not Digital Foundry. I didn't exactly do a perfect comparison here, but if you just kind of ask me if I'm eyeballing it, I would say that the SD card loader seems to run about 4 times the speed of the original disk drive and about 2 times the speed of the CD-Z. But again, that's just me kind of eyeballing it. But I mean, just to you and just the footage, it should be incredibly obvious how much faster one is versus the other. So yeah, that's definitely the biggest selling point. So with that understanding in mind, now you kind of get a sense of like why this thing is cool, why you might need it if you're into the Neo Geo CD. It definitely makes the system vastly more accessible, vastly more playable. So yeah, let's talk about the specifics. Now, the board itself, obviously I didn't do the install or anything like that, but once you have it installed, it actually is pretty cool because it kind of looks stock. The only way you would even notice is there is a slight little SD card slot that kind of emerges out of the rear vent. The vent is actually big enough that you can fit the SD card in through that vent. So in my case, my SD card is blue, which makes it more obvious that it's there. If you were to get a black one, it would be even less noticeable. It could look permanently stock if you wanted to. There's also LEDs on the thing. You can change the colors of the LEDs within the systems menu. That's just kind of, you know, for funsies. That stuff's not that significant. So let's talk about the stuff that does matter. Up here, you can see we have a whole bunch of options, and I want to show you the most important one first, which is when you go down here, you'll actually see one called Update Firmware. So we want to make sure we address this right away. When you get this thing, you're going to want to take the SD card and make sure it's set up and configured properly. So let's talk a little bit about the specifics of that. This device will only understand FAT32 as a format. Now, FAT32 is an old format. It's old. It's designed for old tech. Old tech likes old tech, right? So it makes sense that that's what it's looking for. The problem with FAT32 is that by default, if you're using Windows to format something, it will not format anything bigger than 32 gigabytes to FAT32. That doesn't mean you can't, it just means you need external software to do it, which is what I'm gonna have to tell you here. That's what you need to go do. Because assuming you're the guy out there who's like, I really like the Neo Geo CD and I love the idea of having all the games ever made for it on a single card, you can absolutely do that, just not on a 32 gigabyte card. I put a 128 gigabyte card in there, and that's what I recommend. In order to do that, like I said, I had external software. I downloaded it. It's freeware. You just download, run it, format it, done, no problem. The reason I recommend that particular card size is you will absolutely never need anything bigger than that. No chance in hell. But it will easily house every game ever made. There's only about 100 releases for the Neo Geo CD, including the independent stuff. And yes, they are still making independent games. So you do get new ones every once in a while. Not super often, but every once in a while. You could, if you're more selective, obviously use a smaller card. A 32 gigabyte card would certainly work. You would just have less room to play with it. A 64 gigabyte card is kind of where you go, you'd have a more selective, a more curated collection perhaps. So I own 76 games for the Neo Geo CD out of the nearly 100. And if I recall correctly, that 76 games took up about like 45 gigs. If you have a 64 gigabyte card, you're probably only realistically, after formatting, only going to have like 58, 59 gigabytes to actually use. It would fit all that, but then I don't know how you account for the other like 30 odd games and how much of that would actually be taken up. And then you would have even less space for future indies. All I'm saying is I recommend a 128 gigabyte card, especially now that in the time I make this video, the price difference between a high-end, like this is a high-end Samsung fast read speed SD, micro SD card. It was $13 from Amazon shipped. Like, the 64 gigabyte card is what, 11? Like, spend the extra $2, get the 128 gigabyte card, and never worry about it again. That's my suggestion. So once, assuming you have that card, I would take it, you format it to FAT32 as we discussed. The first thing you want to do is go to the website of the manufacturer of this. Very easy thing to look up. Just look up SD, Neo SD Loader. You'll find it online. Grab the firmware update file, throw that into the root of the directory. Then take the card, put it in here, and go to the system will boot up as you saw earlier, and you go to the firmware update option, just click on update firmware. Now I can click it, but it's just gonna say there's nothing there, which there isn't. Because I didn't actually update this myself, Chris did, but it's a simple process. You just run that, it'll do its thing, reboot, you're done. Once it's done, you're gonna turn the system off, take the card out. Be careful, by the way, when you're sliding the card out. That's like, the only flaw of this particular design is it theoretically would be relatively easy to drop the card and possibly drop it back into the vents. Just be careful, that's all I'm saying. But yeah, once you get the micro SD card out, take it back to your computer, delete the firmware update file, and now we have to talk about folder structure. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Now, I already have all my games sitting on there. These are all games I own. I ripped them myself. I placed them there myself. Now, what you're seeing here in the A section, those are just folders. I made those folders. I created a new folder. I typed ADK World. Now, the cool thing is The folder doesn't actually have to be the name of the game. If for some reason in my own mental organization, ADK World, I thought of as Barney's Big Dinosaur Adventure, I could have called it Barney's Big Dinosaur Adventure and clicked A, and ADK World would have still run. I don't know why you would ever change the name from anything in the actual game title, but if you wanted to hide a game for some reason, you could. There is that idle mahjong game, I guess, so if you're into like your hentai stuff and you don't want anybody to know about it, you can change that to like Barney's Big Dinosaur Adventure so nobody ever clicks on it. That's the only reason I could think of why you would ever do that, but whatever. Point is, you can change the names of the folders to anything you like. It's just, and then it automatically alphabetizes them based on what you did, which is great. What really matters, though, is what you put inside each folder. So inside each folder, you have to put the game files. The game files that it wants is called bin and queue. Now, bin and queue is what is known as an ISO format. An ISO is basically just a digital backup of a disk. So this, like right here, we have King of Fighters 95, the disk. And an ISO would just be a perfect clone of it. That's the basic concept of the technology. So the format specifically of that ISO that it likes is called bin and queue. Bin as a file represents all the game data. The queue file is you best thought of as a set of instructions. It's a blueprint. The queue file is what you tell whatever device you want to read the bin file how to read the bin file. So that's important to have those two in there. Now the thing is, the one flaw I found in this thing is that it's a lot more selective about how that queue file is structured than a lot of other devices would be. So for example, I have things like the mode for the Dreamcast, or I have, actually let's use something that uses bin and queue as well. Say something like the Saturn, the mode for the Saturn, or the RIA for the Saturn, any of those devices. When they have a queue file in there and they're looking for stuff, they weren't very picky about how I had originally archived my games. As I said, I own 76 games, I ripped them all myself, and I was able to just easily dump them into stuff. This one presented me with errors I wasn't anticipating. I'll show you a screenshot here. When I would try to run any of my own rips, I would just get this error, and I didn't know what that meant. Then I sat down and I thought about it, and I'm like, I think I know what the issue is. Because I ran into this once with the Sega CD, and I told Crix about it because it was running off of his Mega EverDrive Pro. And we figured out the problem, and then he fixed it with a firmware update. Basically, a queue file, like I said, is a set of instructions. When you rip the games yourself, depending on the software you use, it will, in the set of instructions at the beginning, will say something like file, quote, and then it will just say the name of the file it's looking for, like, you know, kingoffighters95.bin. But if you rip it yourself, it will often include the pathway you originally ripped it to. So like D:/Neo Geo CD /kingoffighters95.bin. This thing is, in its current firmware, not smart enough to know to just ignore the pathway that it's seeing. So if it had any sort of messed up pathway, it fails. So I had to go into every single queue file I own, open them with Notepad, because that's how easy that is, and then you just go in and find that pathway, delete it, and make sure it just says kingoffighters95.bin or whatever matches the actual bin file. The bin file must be exactly the same name as what is said inside the queue file. As long as those match, you're fine, and it can't have any additional garbage in the header. I would tell the guy who made this thing, maybe do a firmware update to that, because the only reason I was sure that would work is I downloaded a game I already owned just to compare bin files and the queue file specifically, and I saw without the pathway there that it would totally function. So once I did that, I just fixed all my own. It was totally fine. But if anybody else is out there is ripping their own discs, they might run into the same issue. So the current patch for that would be to fix it yourself. Maybe in the future with a firmware update, it can be less selective. I don't know. We'll see if the guy can fix that, if he ever sees this video or is aware of that problem. It's a thing, but not that big of a deal. So once I patched all that out, everything was smooth sailing after that. It was great. So as I mentioned, the most obvious benefit to this thing is the load times are significantly reduced, making everything vastly more playable, vastly more fun as an experience, which is wonderful. But it does have additional benefits on top of it, so I kind of want to go over a few of them right now. So if we go into the options menu here, you can go to settings. Inside the settings is a couple of cool things. Now there's a couple of just like, at the bottom there's things like load animations, like you saw that animation at the beginning. You can do a faster version, a slower version, whatever. You can change the color of the LED, you can activate a screensaver, all that kind of stuff. Just, you know, things that are just kind of for the pretties. Where it actually kind of matters is you see one that says country. Now this is a Japanese Neo Geo CD, but it's currently set to USA region coding. Now, I want to explain how Neo Geo CD region coding works. It is different than other systems. Most systems, when you think of the region coding, at least historically speaking, say a Dreamcast that was Japanese, will have a Japanese BIOS with the Japanese text all over it, and it will be programmed to play only the Japanese discs. So if you put an American disc in there by default, it's not going to do anything. But if you got past the region coding, all it would do is treat the disc as the American disc, even though the system still thinks it's a Japanese system. That's usually how we think of region coding, as a little bit of a policing mechanism to stop imports. The Neo Geo CD is weird because it doesn't work at anything like that. The system's actually region free. So if you have a Japanese system, you can totally play the American discs on it, no problem. What the system cares about is what region it thinks it is. So this system, by default, thinks it's a Japanese system. So if you put an American disc in it, it goes, oh, okay, so that's this Japanese version of the game. The games are weird because each one has different builds of the game. As far as I know, there's 4 region codes with the Neo Geo CD. There was Europe, kind of generically. There was Brazil, oddly enough, the United States, and Japan. So each game has, technically speaking, 4 builds of the game on there. And I say that in a very limited sense because not every game actually took advantage of that. But one example would be Puzzle Bobble. I actually talked about this and I did a whole video on this system with its region coding. Puzzle Bobble is unique because it actually has a difference in all 3 regions. I didn't check the Brazil region at the time, but it had a difference in all 3 of those main regions, Europe, Japan, and the United States. And so the differences can be subtle, sometimes they can be big. So like a lot of the Japanese games, if you set it to the American mode, they actually play in English, which is great. Or, you know, if you are maybe have an American game, like a fighting game, sometimes if you set it to the Japanese mode, the blood activates in the game that doesn't exist in the American version. European mode, sometimes they'll have like extra lives. Like it really is a case-by-case basis. But essentially what I'm telling you is that Neo Geo CD games, the discs themselves are region free. They just had multiple builds on the disc, and that build, which build you get to use, is determined by the system, whatever the system coding it thinks it's going to be in. This allows you to change it to whatever you like. So it's good to play with that because sometimes the game is better in the Japanese mode, sometimes it's better in the American mode, sometimes it's better in the European mode. It really, like I said, case-by-case basis. But you have the option to tinker with that, which is very cool. So that would be the first and foremost thing. So even though it's a Japanese system, it's now running American mode. Now you have the save stuff. So the saves menu is the original default menu that existed within the Neo Geo CD for backing up game save data. It's still there, it's still functional, but there's a bonus one on top of it called store saves and load saves. So this, because you have this SD card, and this is another reason to have a bigger SD card, is that you can actually archive your internal game save data to the SD card. Therefore, you don't really have to worry about the storage of the system anymore. You might have to take an additional step to load and reset the saves you've produced, but you can have, essentially you can make save game data for any game you want and never have to worry about that again, which is great. We already talked about firmware, and then, you know, just things like, you know, updates or the info about the system, what model you're running at, all that sort of stuff. So forgetting all that, we go back to this. Now, again, every game here I've already tested, like the functionality. I really did because I got really annoyed with the bug I was running into, as I described before. But everything runs just fine. So once you click it, and you guys saw in the footage there, it just kind of loads and goes. So one of the cool things is it now actually has an in-game reset. So I tested this earlier with King of Fighters 95. So if you actually press start and select, it's got an in-game menu. That in-game menu has 2 functionalities. One is really cool. It has cheat code functionality. I didn't see that one coming. So not every game supports this, but a bunch do. So like, for example, in King of Fighters 95, you can activate infinite health and stuff like that. And then, so you're unbeatable in the game. And then you can, once you activate it and quit out of the menu, it's already just activated. So you don't have to like reset the game or anything weird like that. It just turns on. And then you start playing the game. And then of course the character is totally invincible and you can't lose. Again, not every game supports this, but a bunch of them seem to, and that's pretty neat. So very cool. The other thing it has is the in-game reset. So rather than having to power cycle, you can actually press that button and it'll just reset back to the default screen, as you can see here. So yeah, very, very cool. Now, another big bonus feature, and we didn't even talk about it yet, is with most ODEs, you actually have to sacrifice the disk drive because the whole point of an ODE is optical disk emulator. It's essentially replicating and replacing the disk drive. That is actually not the case with this model. You're allowed to keep both. Now, so if you're like, hey, I want to do the mod, but I want to also be able to run my disks, which is a great idea, you can absolutely do that. So what'll happen is you'll put the disk in and you'll turn the system on. It'll still come to this menu. It'll be like, oh no, it's not playing my disks. What's wrong? You have to do an additional step. So here you can see CD menu, you press D, and then it'll be like, okay, do you want us to go ahead and start up the disk-based game? So at that point, it'll just reset the console and boot the disk up. And then that'll bring you into the menu where the disk drive detects what game you've got. It says like, okay, you're good to go. You press start, and then you can enjoy your horrendous load times. But one of the there's a bonus feature on top of that, which it alludes to right there, which is, remember what I mentioned about the region coding? When you change that, it also changed that for the disk drive. So you get the bonus feature now of all your disks also can enjoy the benefits of being region-free and region-altered to whatever you like. A few other points of note here. So with this specific device, as I said, it's beyond my technical skill set to install, so make sure you have somebody who knows how to do that. There are 2 versions of it. This is important. There's one built specifically for the top loader, which is what we have here. There's also built one specifically for the front loader. The device is not interchangeable between the 2 models. You have to get the one that you have a compatible system for, that you feel like installing it on. I'm imagining the majority of you would be more likely to have the top loader, given that the front loader is vastly less common. But the top loader is also, or sorry, the front loader is vastly less reliable, so it's also the better one to try and upgrade, I think, because it's less likely to be functional. But that's, you could then save it in the sense by it'll now work. It won't, the disk drive won't, but the ODE will, whatever. And if you're thinking Neo Geo CD, can I do anything with that? No. As of now, there is no SD loader design for the Neo Geo CD. So, yeah. I think this thing is phenomenal. That one bug aside about, that was more on my end, but I do think that should be a firmware update patch. Aside from that, I think this thing is phenomenal. I'm sure there's individual games that maybe something doesn't load quite right, because you have to remember that one of the things about this is the Neo Geo CD was not designed to read games that quickly. So it is possible you will introduce additional errors or bugs in games. I didn't run into that specifically. I'm just throwing it out there that is a possibility. It was an issue with some ODEs for things like the Dreamcast and stuff, but firmware patches, I know that the guy still does this, and every once in a while somebody's like, hey, there's a bug with this game, work on it. He does it. So I would expect to kind of stay on top of that, and there's still to be firmware updates, and the more and more games will get perfected. But yeah, it ran everything pretty well in my experience. So I'm very happy with it, and it really, really, truly unlocks the system, because that truly was the biggest hindrance, which is just the load times on this machine are atrocious. But if you essentially get rid of that, then you just have this wonderful library of games that are very, very playable. And this is by far the most affordable version of the system. So from me, huge recommendation. I think it's phenomenal. So again, a link will be in the description to Stone Age Gamer if you want to check this out. As well, if you need a guy to install it, Chris's information is in there. He lives down in Indiana. He also, you can drop stuff off if you want to save on shipping. That's up to you, but you can talk to him about that. Very reasonable prices on stuff too. He's an awesome guy. So yeah, again, huge shout out to both of them. Check it out. Go to stoneagegamer.com. And if you guys could do me a favor, please again, like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, and of course, new travel channel. Appreciate the support on all those things. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.